Hello, listeners, and welcome to the Logos Project. I am your host, Dom. This week, I talk with theologian and cultural critic Dr. Larry Chapp. Enjoy. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Logos Project. In today's episode, I am joined by Dr. Larry Chapp. As you all know, our mission statement here at the Logos Project is insights from the tradition to explain the modern world so that we can successfully move into the future. Our topic today is traditionalism, liberalism, and what might be the way forward. Dr. Larry Chapp is a retired professor of theology. He taught for 20 years at DeSales University near Allentown, Pennsylvania. Dr. Chapp received his doctorate from Fordham University in 1994 with a specialization in the theology of Hans Urs von Balthasar. He is the author of the blog Gaudium et Spes 22. Welcome, Dr. Chapp.
Hey, it's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Anytime. Thanks for coming on. I've been wanting to do this interview because I have a lot of questions for you. I've been reading your blog, and I have a lot of friends who come to me with questions about traditionalism and Pope Francis and the Second Vatican Council. And so I wanted to do an episode with you since you are a subject matter expert.
I hope so. Yeah. I try.
So I guess I wanted to start off with the fact that on your blog, there is a manifesto that you co-wrote with Mark Barnes and is it Dominic?
Sean Domenichik.
Yes, that's right, with Tradiste, if I'm not mistaken.
That's right. He's with Tradiste. It's a very good blog post.
Gotcha. So there's 4 statements in the manifesto, and I think that would be a good way to open up this conversation. So I'm going to go ahead, if that's okay with you, read off the first statement and ask you what that means, what the manifesto is trying to get at.
Sure.
The first statement in the manifesto is the church is not primarily a defensive castle, but above all, a missionary people united in love. Why was that necessary to say?
Well, because it's the animating truth of the church, that its primary function is to bring Christ to the world. Its primary function is missionary zeal, and its primary function is to bring Christ's love to the world. And it's necessary to repeat that because oftentimes it seems to us that what goes under the banner of traditionalism in these days is more concerned with promoting a certain ecclesiological ideology, a certain church ideology, than it is with promoting the love of Christ. And I think that's a problem.
Is this connected to the Second Vatican Council when it comes to, was it von Balthasar's statement of letting down the bastions or something like that?
Well, yeah, Balthasar wrote, it's called Raising the Bastions.
Okay.
R-A-Z-I-N-G, not as in lifting up more bastions, but tearing down the bastions, yes. And he wrote that in the 50s. And I don't know to what extent it had an influence on the Second Vatican Council, but it's a similar sort of project, the notion being that the church needs to be able to share the great treasury that she possesses, the treasury of Christ, with the world, but she can't do that if she's hiding behind these high defensive walls, hiding from the world.
And on the flip side, some of my traditionalist friends would say this, you want to make sure that you don't let the world in too much either, or conform to the world.
No, that's true. I'm starting off here with the strongest possible sort of statement as to why we wrote what we did. But yeah, these are complicated issues, complex issues, and a manifesto can only start a conversation, which is what we're having here. I remember the Protestant theologian Karl Barth, who was probably the most famous Protestant theologian of the 20th century, said that the church opened her windows to let in a little fresh air, and instead a hurricane blew in. And we can talk about that. We can talk about what caused that hurricane. I don't think Vatican II caused the hurricane. I think cultural forces did. But still, the traditionalists do have a point, that, look, what happened here? When the church opened herself to the world, and instead of sharing the treasury of Christ with the world seems to have rushed in and to replaced Christ with something else.
Gotcha. The second phrase in the manifesto is the perennial philosophy of St. Thomas is a foundation for the valuable new theologies. What do you mean by that?
Well, simply that Catholicism cannot really be understood in its modern form without taking Thomas Aquinas into consideration. Because obviously the scriptures are important, the church fathers are important, Augustine's important, other people are important, but Aquinas is the fulcrum upon which the entirety of sort of Catholic tradition turns. I don't want to overstate that, but it's true. Um, Aquinas became the foundation for many of the church's later doctrines. And so, yeah, even if you disagree with Aquinas, as I do with small things here and there, after all, he did deny the Immaculate Conception of Mary. He wasn't right about everything. But nevertheless, you have to take him into consideration because of his profound and deep influence. And overall, I mean, there's nobody in the entire history of the Catholic tradition who has had such a powerful synthesizing mind, which is why the church highly recommends Aquinas as the kind of barometer, the starting point of you. You don't have to stay with Aquinas. You can go beyond. And just as Aquinas went beyond the fathers by using Aristotle, we can go beyond Aquinas too. But you have to start with Aquinas, I think.
That makes sense, yeah. And what do you mean by new theologies?
Well, I mean that obviously you can't freeze theology in the 13th century. Aquinas himself would have been very opposed to that. I mean, we need to remember that Thomas Aquinas got into a lot of trouble in his time because he dared to introduce Aristotle into the equation, and Aristotle was thought to be almost an atheist, for crying out loud, and nobody wanted to touch him. All right, and so we need to recover the courage of Aquinas in terms of his innovation. That doesn't mean dissent from doctrine. He was thoroughly orthodox, but it means being open to the currents of intellectual thinking of our own time. Aquinas had the issues of his time. We have our own, and there are issues that Aquinas could not have even fathomed in his time. So new theologies I have in mind would be, let's look at the 20th century, the immediate precursors to the Second Vatican Council. There was a great explosion of theological and literary and philosophical intellectuality in the Catholic Church in the early to mid 20th century. It wasn't just theology. It was people like, Bouillet, Guardini, Ratzinger, Balthasar, de Lubac, and then literary figures like George Bernanos, who wrote Diary of a Country Priest, Francois Mauriac, Viper's Tangle. Philosophy, oh my goodness, Etienne Gilson, Joseph Pieper, Jacques Maritain, Gabriel Marcel. The list goes on and on and on of the tremendous and powerful intellectual thinkers, of Dietrich von Hildebrand in the 20th century, that we are still just beginning to scratch the surface. And obviously all of those people were deeply respectful of Aquinas and sought to synthesize Aquinas with modern thinking. That's why we call this a new traditionalism. It is a traditionalism. I mean, it seems a little bit redundant to say a new traditionalism, since it would seem tradition would not be new. But a tradition in the Catholic sense is a living tradition, not a dead tradition, which means it grows and it develops. So there can be new elements within it.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I remember I was visiting home a while back, and so I grew up in the sspx actually, and around the age of, how old was I? I think it was 12 years old. We switched to the Fraternity of St. Peter. And so I remember I was visiting back home, and I went to an SSPX bookstore, and this was when my interest in theology was rising. And I entered the bookstore, and all there was Counter-Reformation saints like St. Francis de Sales, which is wonderful. I have a couple books of his, and I absolutely love him.
Oh my goodness! Your listeners, read Francis de Sales. What a magnificent doctor of the Church.
Yes. So I'm not trying to disparage some of these thinkers, but it was like the bookstore itself was frozen in time.
Yeah.
All I could find was books on piety by Saint Alphonsus, Robert Bellarmine, which again are great. I'm not trying to disparage them, but it was a strange feeling. I walked out of that bookstore with my curiosity not satisfied. I didn't buy anything. And because I was interested in the debates going on today, and I really wanted to read Ratzinger, and since I've been reading him ferociously. But so I see what you mean now by new theologies as well. And the next statement in the manifesto was interesting. the natural law and the preferential option for the poor have been united in Catholic social teaching.
Yes.
What do you mean by that?
Well, let's back up a second. We're all very familiar with the great divide that has taken place in the modern church between people who call themselves conservative and orthodox and are concerned with things like, abortion, pro-life, and that sort of stuff. And then the other side of the divide are the social justice warriors who are out there fighting for, economic equity and anti-racism and anti-war and all of these great so-called leftist causes. And there has been a great divide in the church. And so what we're seeking in the manifesto is to understand that a full understanding of the church's traditional natural law social teaching unites all of those things together and does not divide them. So we're calling out both the left and the right here. We're calling out the left for its singular focus on all of these trendy left-wing political causes. Well, they're not trendy. They're legitimate political causes, anti-war, anti-racism. We're also calling out the right and realizing that, there is a social component to Catholic social teaching, and orthodoxy does demand a preferential option for the poor. I mean, this is not just modern liberation theology. This goes back to St. Francis of Assisi, Mother Teresa. I mean, this is as orthodox as it gets. And so what we're trying to do is to bring that divide together and to realize that natural law encompasses both sexual morality and social justice. And by the way, social justice encompasses sexual morality, and sexual morality has to be concerned with social justice.
I've really found when talking to fellow Catholics that their political ideologies kind of determines whether they're a traditionalist or a more hippie, kind of relativist Catholic. And so instead of the faith, informing how you view the political realm, it seems like the right-wing, left-wing politics has informed the way they receive the council, which is a huge topic. I really want to get into that, but
it's a problem because you know what? I mean, God bless everyone, and I mean that because the fact of the matter is, the average Catholic out there doesn't have time to sit down and read a bunch of theology books. And they can read a blog or two or something like that, but they're busy with their kids, their jobs. Many of them have illnesses and tragedies in their life. I get it. I mean, I'm the same way. And if I hadn't been a professional theologian, I probably wouldn't understand half of this stuff either. And so my point is that people tend to fall into these natural binaries. It's human nature. All right. You don't have the time to read and think more deeply about it. So you fall into these channelized, highly politicized categories that your culture has provided to you. And rare is the person that can transcend this divide, which is why it's kind of a shame that right now the church doesn't do a better job of educating her laity as to how that divide can be. It seems as if in the church herself, amongst her clerics, amongst her priests, you find these same binaries. Mm-hmm. You find the radical leftist priests, and then you find the Father Altman right-wing anti-COVID conspiracy priests that are out there, and so it seems like the church has failed to lead in this regard, and the average layperson needs to be led by the church. And that's why we issued this manifesto, and that's why we made this comment about uniting the preferential option for the poor, the social justice teaching of the church, and natural law, moral theology. And the church needs to get on the case here.
Yeah, that's awesome. When I first read it, I was like, yes, this needs to be given to the average layperson, as you said, who isn't reading theology books.
Right.
Because how else are they going to know? So I'm really excited about this manifesto. Yes.
Yeah.
And so the fourth phrase, and then I want to get into this leads us into the topic of liturgy, which is huge. The fourth phrase says, the necessary liturgical renewal was begun, betrayed, and left unaccomplished. So this aspect of the debate is something that I'm very passionate about. I grew up with the Latin Mass, and I grew up in a post-conciliar era, but it was like a pre-conciliar situation after the council, if that makes any sense.
It does.
Because of the sspx and eventually the fraternity, and then eventually getting acquainted with Ratzinger, Balthasar, and the council really changed a lot for me.
I went through a similar process. I wasn't in the sspx, but I went through a whole thing. Go ahead.
Gotcha. So yeah, what do you mean by begun, betrayed, and left unaccomplished?
Well, the fact is the liturgical renewal movement started in the early to mid 20th century. People like Damoto Kazel and other people, and there was a need. Almost everybody agreed. Almost every theologian agreed. Even some of the more deeply conservative and traditional ones agreed that there needed to be a reform of the liturgy. No less a light than Pius XII already started to reform the liturgy in 1955, before the council, where he restored certain aspects of the Easter Triduum and so on. And that really upsets some hyper-traditionalists today. Oh, you need to go back before even Pius XII to get to the real liturgy. You probably are well aware of all this. And anyway, so then you get to the Second Vatican Council's document on the liturgy, Sacrosanctum Concilium, the very first document of the council, which shows you how important it is. And if you read that document, it says Latin is still to be given, priority. Vernacular only in certain exigencies, cultural situations, maybe. Gregorian chant is to be given pride of place. The church's great tradition of polyphony and music is to be preserved. There was nothing at all in Sacrosanctum Concilium about a sort of wholesale gutting of the old liturgy and replacing it with something utterly new. And yet, and so we support the people who wrote the manifesto, Mark, Sean, and I. We support the concept that the old Mass needed a reform, but we have deep questions about whether or not the Novus Ordo, the Mass of Paul VI, promulgated in 1970, if that really was what the Council Fathers had in mind. And there's a lot of people out there, and I think this drives a lot of traditionalists too, who are not happy with the Novus Ordo. Now, I would not be in the camp that wants to trash the Novus Ordo, and it's from Satan. It was a Freemason conspiracy. Bugnini was a Freemason, and he railroaded. I don't want to get into all that. It's a valid liturgy. It can be done quite reverently. I've seen it done absolutely beautifully. It is sustained to the prayer life of billions of Catholics around the world. Let's not get on that bandwagon where it's trash. But you know what? It is a deficient liturgical reform, in my opinion.
Hey audience, I'm interrupting this wonderful conversation for two reasons. The first is simply that we had an outage and lost connection. Don't worry, the episode will resume in just a few seconds. The second is this: if you enjoy topics in philosophy, theology, and culture, if you want to hear from more philosophers, theologians, and cultural critics, consider donating at www.patreon.com/thelogosproject. If you're new to the show, check out our content. We're growing rapidly here at the Logos Project, but we cannot do it without you. So consider helping us get that YouTube equipment. Thank you for your consideration. Without further ado, back to our conversation. Okay, we're back. Sorry about the outage, everyone. Dr. Chapp, you were talking about the liturgical movement renewal in the liturgy and Sacrosanctum Concilium. You also mentioned Odo Cassel. I wanted to show this to the audience for those who want to do some research in this area. This is a book called The Mystery of Christian Worship. So you were saying about the liturgical movement being begun, betrayed, and left unaccomplished.
Yeah, because there was a need for, as I said, for a retrieval of the liturgy, a renewal of it, a reform. And for example, I truly believe that the Mass should be in the vernacular, and the language of the people. I truly also believe that the Eucharistic prayer and other aspects of liturgy should be prayed out loud so that people can hear. On the other hand, I think the Mass should be prayed ad orientem, with the priest facing away from the people, everybody facing towards the Lord, and so on. I actually attend an Anglican ordinariate parish where, if your listeners know what that is, I mean, it's Anglicans that have converted to Catholicism, but Pope Benedict let them keep their liturgy in so many ways. And it's gorgeous. And in many ways, I think that's what the Council Fathers had in mind: Mass in the vernacular, prayer spoken out loud, but ad orientem. We receive communion kneeling at an altar rail on the tongue, via intinction and stuff. No, I'm not saying every liturgy has to be like that or anything of the sort. But these are things that I think should and could be done to to enhance the Novus Ordo, and I think that would go a long way towards relieving a lot of the stresses that so many people seem to have around the liturgy today.
You mentioned the vernacular. I've been reading this book here by Joseph Ratzinger, which is the Theological Highlights of Vatican II, and he talks about...
Great book.
Yes, I'm thoroughly enjoying it. I'm almost done with it. I haven't been able to put it down since yesterday. I started like 2 days ago. And he mentions that in the council, there was some ovations being given for Latin and others for the vernacular and bringing it back to the people so that people could participate and understand what was going on. And the ovations for the Latin were done in poor Latin, while the ones against it were done in really good classical Latin. So I thought that was really ironic, but it points to it points to the idea here is that you have to know what's going on. So the reason why I really love the Latin myself is I studied a lot of Latin when I was young, and also I had a introduction to the liturgy that I'm very blessed to have had in the Congregation of Solem. I was part of the Our Lady of Clear Creek.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah. So that's why liturgy is so dear to me, and especially Gregorian chant. And
yes, me too.
And Gregorian chant cannot be done in English. I'm sorry. You can do it. It's just...
it's interesting that you bring that point. I don't want to interrupt your train of thought, but one of the things that I like and don't like about the Anglican ordinariate liturgy is we do a lot of chant. It's chant in English, which is Anglican plain chant style, which is not Gregorian. Mm-hmm. And I prefer Gregorian chant myself, but I think you're right. Yes. Gregorian chant is a prayer form that developed for Latin, and it needs Latin.
I mean, there's so much that goes into it, the Latin tonic accent and the way they understand rhythm. Yeah. It's a beautiful, deep field in liturgy. But at the same time, I do agree with Ratzinger. I've been to several ordinariate masses, and it's basically a Tridentine Mass in Old English. It's beautiful.
Yeah, it's gorgeous. And hopefully you went to one that had a full choir and things like that.
No, not even, unfortunately. It was like a basement Mass. It wasn't very... Oh,
that's a shame.
It was a shame. But still, the structure, the way it was said, everything was just very reverent, and the people prayed it. And obviously, they understood what was going on.
And the prayers are just so beautiful. I mean, the prayer of humble access, the penitential prayer. There are 3 major sort of penitential Eucharistic prayers in that liturgy that are just gorgeous. But you're right. I mean, I fully support the traditional Latin Mass and the communities that wish to worship in that fashion. I think Pope Francis, God bless him, made a mistake with Traditionis Custodes. I think he's making a mistake in suppressing the Latin Mass, because it's a deeply meaningful liturgy to many, many Catholics. And more than that, Pope Benedict pointed out, what was once sacred can now not be deemed bad. I mean, horrible.
Yeah.
We can't do it this way anymore. I don't think Pope Francis really thinks the Latin Mass is bad inherently so. I just think that he thinks that those who attend it are opposed to Vatican II, opposed to him, opposed to the Novus Ordo. And I think he's mostly wrong about that. There's a certain element of that in the traditionalist movement, but I think that's exaggerated.
Yeah. And there's also a difference between, say, the sspx or even the fraternity, although I definitely don't want to lump them in together, and, a diocesan priest saying the Tridentine Mass. That's not the same thing.
Right.
I have seen, obviously in the sspx, there is an anti-Vatican II sentiment. I mean, I don't think I've ever met someone in the sspx who doesn't believe that.
Well, it's the whole reason they exist. I mean, people wrongly... I just wrote a blog post today on Vatican II, and I mentioned the sspx. The fact is, people think that it's all about the liturgy. It has nothing to do with the liturgy, because the Church has long since granted the sspx, as it had granted almost up until Pope Francis, every Catholic priest the right to say the old liturgy. The issue is Vatican II. The sspx, specifically Dignitatis Humanae, the document on religious freedom, that's what Archbishop Lefebvre most objected to, that Vatican II endorsed the idea that all religions should be granted freedom in the civil state. And that drove him nuts, because he thought Catholicism should be imposed by legislation. I mean, that's a bit of an exaggeration, but that's what it boils down to. I mean, you know about all that. You were in the sspx. You were raised that way. You know what I'm talking about.
Yes. I get a lot of questions, and it's hard to give a thorough answer to some questions that come from a genuinely, a place of concern, because what we're seeing now in the pontificate of Francis, I'm sorry to say, is just not very pretty. In the name of collegiality, there's these like crackdowns on the traditional liturgy, which to be fair is sometimes used in a way that's ideological. It's like a tool, but not always, as you said. So we could go for a long time on liturgy, but I do want to give the audience a kind of a historical background to the council. And so for that, we could start with what are traditional Catholics right about in general? And in other words, what needs reform in the post-conciliar church right now? Does that make sense?
Yeah. The reform of the reform, right? Okay, I'm not saying that the church should return to the old Latin Mass and impose it on everyone, but I am saying that we need to seriously look at the complaints of the traditionalists with regard to the sorry state of liturgy in the church today. I also think the traditionalists get something else right, and that is the necessity of Catholics to be deeply devoted to things like the saints and the old devotionals and the old ascetical practices of things like meatless Fridays and all those old markers of what it meant. A lot of the women, for example, in my Anglican ordinary parish wear veils and things like that. I'm not saying you have to wear a veil. I'm saying these are the kinds of things that I think what attract a lot of young people to the traditionalist movement are, in a sense, the accoutrements, the trappings of the old Catholic disciplines that have been lost, and many of them are quite beautiful. On the other hand, I think that traditionalists are not traditional enough. That's the problem, because in order to be a traditionalist, you need to understand that tradition is a living thing, and it is not freeze-framed in 1955. And you cannot use an ancient magisterium of the church in order to discredit the magisterium of the church, because then you're cutting off the limb on which you sit. You can't say Pope since Vatican II is a heretical pope or a deeply flawed pope, so flawed that you don't have to listen to them, that they're all riddled with modernism, they're all riddled with mistakes, that Vatican II wasn't a valid council, it was a horrible council that we can just ignore. You get the point. You can't say, in some sense, tradition stopped in 1962. And so we just need, and so in many ways, I think the elements of the traditionalist movement that is logically consistent are the sede vacantist types who have the honesty to say, yeah, pretty much apostasy began in 1962, and it's been a false church since then. And if you want the true church, you need to go back to all of the forms in 462. I think that's the only truly theologically consistent position that many traditionalists should adopt. And indeed, in the sspx, of course, as you would know, you have this rift between the sede vacantists and those who say, no, those are real popes. They're just really bad ones. They're just kind of stinky popes, really bad stinky popes. And we're therefore thoroughly legitimated in dissenting from them. But I do think there's a certain logic to the sede vacantis position. They understand you can't weaponize the ancient magisterium or the modern magisterium because you're shooting yourself in the foot. And that's my biggest problem with the traditionalist movement. You need to have a more sophisticated understanding of how tradition works. Yes, the church is in a bad way today. It is. But it's been in a bad way before. And a lot of people need to just read some church history in order to really get a sense of the fact that in a lot of ways, the church is almost always in one gigantic mess. It's like the church is always stepping its foot into a gigantic cow pie. I'm from Nebraska, so I can say that. But to go back to what traditionalists get right, you often hear people criticize the traditionalist movement, as I just did, on the grounds that, you don't know church history, it's always in a bad way. And there's a certain truth to that, which is why I mention it. However, I think traditionalists are correct to point out that there is a unique challenge posed to the church by modern culture that it has never faced before. That the church today does face the gravest threat from outside that she has ever faced before. That modern techno culture, modern surveillance capitalism, the modern surveillance national security state, the modern consumerist capitalist juggernaut, the modern atheistic naturalistic juggernaut is a threat the church has never faced before, and it has infected the church. And I've blogged a lot about this, which is why I do have a deep sympathy with many traditionalists who have an inchoate sense, a sort of connatural sense. You know what? Something's not right. There's something really, really wrong, both outside of the church and inside of the church. And there's a real existential insight there that I don't think Pope Francis takes seriously enough. I really don't. I was a big fan of Pope John Paul, Pope Benedict. I'll just be honest, I'm not a huge fan of Pope Francis. I don't think he's a heretic. I don't think he's a false pope. I'm not a big fan of Archbishop Vigano or Taylor Marshall or any of these guys. But I don't think Pope Francis is a good pope. And I think he's just made matters worse. The role of the pope is to clarify, but he's actually muddied the waters. And I think what's happened is a lot of formerly conservative Catholics, what I call JP2 Benedict kind of Catholics, formerly conservative Catholics, have been red-pilled by the papacy of Pope Francis and have basically said, look, okay, I was willing to hang on with this whole Vatican II thing so long as we had good popes. But now we have a lousy pope. And so to heck with Vatican II, to heck with the modern church, I'm just going back before the council. And I'm going to go to a traditional Latin Mass parish, and I'm just going to say, scorched earth, the modern church is dead to me. And I think that's what's happened. I really do. And I think it's a bad move to make. It's a false move to make, but it's an understandable move to make.
Absolutely. And the fact that you're verbalizing that, I think, is very important because these young people, right, they have this legitimate reaction, although it's being channeled in the wrong direction, I think. You can't just reject the council because everything is crazy. But the problem is people's attitude towards the council changes based on the pontiff of the day. How does that make any theological sense? That's what I don't understand. A lot of these young people want to be faithful Catholics, and what they see causes them deep concern, and no one's saying, that it's happening.
It's true. We're in a bad way, and I think we're in a bad way in a rather unique way that the church has never faced before. And like I said, I don't want to overstate my objections to Pope Francis, but I think at best he's a very average pope. And my only statement to your listeners, your viewers, would be, hey, this too shall pass. Right? I mean, I'm not, I'm not praying for the Pope to die. I'm just saying we all die. We'll get a new Pope and he might be worse. He might even be worse. So, better the devil than the one you don't. And Pope Francis's defense, let's point out something here about Pope Francis. Been kind of hard on the Holy Father. Let me point out something. A lot of traditionalists believe that he's just, oh my God, he's just a liberal. Mm-hmm. Just a progressive, an old-fashioned progressive. I don't think that's true. I mean, if you're an old coot like I am, 63, I lived through the silly season of the post-conciliar church. I went to seminary, then got my PhD. I was educated by liberals and that progressive post-Vatican II. I tell you, I have the bona fides. I understand what liberals are. Pope Francis ain't no liberal. If he was a liberal, we'd have women priests by now. Mm-hmm. If he were a liberal, we'd have contraception by now. If he were a liberal, we'd have gay marriage in the church right now. If he were a liberal, we would have, divorce and remarriage now. Although he did kind of give a wink and a nod to that. Notice, you can tell his sympathies lie with people in broken marriages. And he's Pope. If he were a liberal, it would have been really easy for him to simply wave his papal wand, like he did with Traditionis Custodes, and say, okay, the divorce and remarriage, you get one mulligan. That's a Gulf term, a do-over. You get that's kind of like the Orthodox, you get one mulligan. You get a marital mulligan. But after that, no, wait a minute. Okay. He could have done that, but he didn't. He just put a little footnote in Amoris and said, let's let pastors kind of handle this on the ground with accompaniment and so on, whatever that means. It's vague. But nevertheless, if he really wanted to change the teaching, he could have. So, and a liberal would have. So he has not granted to the liberals their giant wish list of women priests, married priests, contraception, gay marriage, divorce and remarriage. He hasn't given them any of those things. So I don't know. He's an enigma to me. He's an enigma.
Yeah. You did write a blog post recently how he holds to the ideals, but sees them as ideals. Yes. When it comes to his pastoral approach, he's more feet on the ground. Ideals are nice, but let's be real, right? Something like that.
Oh, yes. It's a kind of, to use an Argentinian analogy, it's a kind of Peronist populism. If you know about Juan Perón as the populist leader, we must always keep the Pope's Argentinian background in view. I don't think he is a Peronist, but he learned from Juan Perón's playbook, which was you maintain certain lofty ideals, and you maintain, so to get away from Perón for a second, just go back to the church. You maintain all of the orthodox teaching of the church. You maintain all of her moral doctrines, but then you turn them into ideals. And on the ground, you instruct your priests to essentially tell people whatever you want to do. Well, I'm exaggerating, but you get my point.
Yeah.
To be pastorally, the phrase I use is latitudinarian. Okay, latitudinarian. It's a big tent church. It's a field hospital church. It's a church, as was it James Joyce said, here comes everybody. So that's, I think, Pope Francis's vision.
Gotcha. Great. This is great stuff. The goal of this interview is to offend as many people as we can. So,
yes, I like to offend.
I feel like I really get along theologically with people who offend everyone on all the aisles, because it shows that there's some critical thinking going on there. But this leads us to our second question, which I have a somewhat of a background in. Basically, what are traditional Catholics wrong about? What needed reform in the pre-conciliar church? Now, obviously, I'm much younger. I did not grow up in the pre-conciliar church, but in a way, I did, because of the attitude of the sspx. So I was talking to a friend recently. I'm going to have him on the show as well. He grew up in the sspx as well. He wrote an article. It was shared on Facebook by Dr. Triffitt. I think you might have seen it. I'm not sure. It was and so he was a classmate of mine a couple semesters ago. And so we're going to be talking a lot about the sspx and just traditionalism in general. But so yeah, the question is, what needed reform in the pre-conciliar church?
A lot of things, really. I would draw people's attention to the fact that no less a light than a very young Father Joseph Ratzinger, later Pope Benedict, I think he was no more than 32 or 33 years old, in 1958, had his real first major article published in a German journal called Hochschule or something like that. And the title of the article was "The New Paganism in the Church," or "The New Heathenism in the Church," as it's sometimes translated. And what Ratzinger proceeded to do in 1958 before the council was to lay out everything that he thought was wrong with the church of his era. In a nutshell, it boiled down to worldliness. The number one problem with the pre-Vatican II church was that people had grown comfortable with sort of middle-class, existence, with the affluence of our Western consumerist societies, with the material well-being that all of this brings, and that penultimate things had become ultimate things, and ultimate things had become unreal to us. In other words, our whole focus was on material well-being. Our whole focus was on getting ahead in this life. We had lost that eschatological, otherworldly, supernatural focus. This is what Ratzinger's point was. And therefore, because there was no deep supernatural sense, no deep eschatological sense, no real faith, and that people were essentially just living Western bourgeois culture, Ratzinger said that essentially the faith was purely legalistic. I guess the theological words would be juridical and forensic, but it's, legalistic. It was a very superficial, legalistic, law-based approach to the faith. Now, the evidence for the fact that this is what was wrong with the preconciliar church is that after the council, that church collapsed almost overnight. Okay, so nobody bothered to attend to the theology of the council, what the council was really saying, because the preconciliar church had been focused so much on simply the externals of the faith as a legal requirement, that once the church kind of relaxed the rules a bit, it's not that people then sought the deeper theological reasons why the church was relaxing the rules. It's just that now they say, oh my God, I can eat meat on Fridays, for crying out loud. Oh yeah, I don't have to. Well, all right, okay, great, all right. And so they one legalism led to a different form of legalism, and that's why the bottom fell out almost overnight. I would also point out to the fact to Latin Mass devotees that many preconciliar Latin masses were done very poorly, very, very poorly. Priests mumbling through Latin they barely understood. Most Catholics preferring the low mass to the solemn high mass, because oftentimes in the old liturgy, the low mass would go 35 minutes, especially since homilies were so de-emphasized. You might get a homily of 4 minutes. Okay. And so we need to understand that there was some decrepitude in the pre-Vatican II liturgy. That people tend to forget. People go to Latin masses now. They go to these Latin mass parishes, all right? And since it's the only Latin mass on a Sunday, anywhere within 80 miles, you pull out all the bells and whistles. It's a solemn high mass and the parish is full. And so you think this is what the Latin liturgy was all about. But actually, most liturgies were not that grand. And so my point would be, if we ever went back to the old Latin Mass being the ordinary form of the liturgy in the church, so that every parish everywhere in the world did that Latin Mass, you would see a lot of really lousy masses again. And so one of the raps against the Novus Ordo is it's done so poorly. Well, guess what? The Latin Mass was done very poorly as well in many parishes. So there's a romanticizing going on here, an idealizing of what it must have been like in the preconciliar church to attend Mass. It really actually wasn't that much different from what it's like to attend Mass now. The form was very different, but the actual existential punch of the liturgy wasn't much more.
Yeah, absolutely. What's funny for me is that I started reading specifically I'm on a Ratzinger binge right now, but Ratzinger as well, as well as de Lubac and Balthasar. But as I'm reading Ratzinger, he's describing my upbringing. It's very strange. And so also for school, let's see, we read this book here by Father Pinkers on
that's a great book.
Yeah. And when I read that, it was like 2 or 3 that's the bigger version, the better version. This one's the condensed version.
I have that on my bookshelf over there.
Yeah. No, so as I was reading this book, it was very surreal. It was like what was being described was my upbringing and why it needed reform. And so I won't go through the whole thing, but I have a quick list here, and this is for the audience. Catechesis was just memorizing answers for certain questions. I think probably from the Baltimore Catechism. I don't even remember what catechism it was.
It was the Baltimore Catechism. Yes, that's what everybody read in the United States.
Yeah, and when it comes to morality, it was purely deontological. It was like, what can I do? What can I not do? It had nothing to do with the gifts of the Spirit, with the life of the Spirit in your soul. And what I find really interesting, and I have a quote here from Ratzinger, was when it comes to the Mass, especially as you said, low Mass, you'd be sitting in the back of the church. Stuff was happening up there that you could not hear, sometimes could not see, and you just waited till it was over. And sometimes, in certain cases, where I went, there was no homily, so it was like a 25-minute Mass, and you would go to that one because you get to go home sooner.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and so what would you do? So if you were a better Catholic, you would say the Rosary, or you would pray Marian devotions, novenas, which are all great and wonderful and beautiful. But there was this sense in my spiritual life growing up that my personal relationship when it comes to the religious was with Mary. Jesus was a memorized formula in the background from the Baltimore Catechism. I didn't really know him. And Mary didn't really have anything to do with the church. And so I was reading this earlier today, and I just want to read this quote, and he basically described exactly my experience. Ratzinger says, in practice, this meant that while the priest was busy with his archaic liturgy, the people were busy with their devotion to Mary. And he basically just described everything that was going on. And so I'm sorry I'm going on with this tangent, but
keep going.
Yeah, it's for the audience. I read this book right here, which is Mary, the Church at the Source. It's selected writings by Joseph Ratzinger and Hans-Urs von Balthasar. And I started seeing the contribution of the Second Vatican Council when it comes to Mariology in a way that just completely floored me. How they integrate her in proper ecclesiology, and how you cannot separate Mary and the Church, and how she was very much so separated in my upbringing from the Church. And so that's one thing. I could keep going. I mean,
well, that's one of the things. Regard to Mary, for example, in the Second Vatican Council, there were certain council fathers that wanted to have a whole separate document on the Virgin Mary, which would have only doubled down on her separateness, as she was compartmentalized almost in an idolatrous way. But no, the cooler heads prevailed at the council, and so there was a section on Mary, but it was at the end of Lumen Gentium, the document on the Church, and she was given a new title, Mary, Mother of the Church, and she was properly placed where she belongs as the Mother of the Church, Mother of God, yes, Mother of the Church. That Mary only makes sense in her theological role within the context of the Church, within the context of the Eucharist. And you mentioned Ratzinger and Balthasar. So many traditionalists hate Balthasar because, oh my God, he was the one who said everybody goes to heaven. He did not say that, by the way. He did not say that. He says we should hope everyone goes to heaven, and have a real hope that might be. Oh, well, what about Judas? And just stop it. Just stop it, okay? You don't know who's in heaven or hell, and neither do I, and neither does Balthasar. Nobody does but God. But my point with regard to this is that Balthasar wrote beautifully about Mary, and I wish the traditionalists would get off of their anti-Balthasar kick with regard to, heaven and hell and all that, and realize that this man is the most orthodox theologian out there. And he is a champion of orthodoxy. And what he writes about Mary is so profoundly beautiful. And it's very much in line with the Second Vatican Council. But I'm derailing your point, which is that Vatican II Church, there was this disconnect between Mary and the liturgy and the Church. All of these institutions were kind of just sort of separated from each other.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I also have some questions from patrons, but I wanted to talk a little bit about the universal call to holiness.
Yes,
and yes, and I want to kind of set you up a little bit. So another thing that I experienced growing up, and this can be kind of summarized in something that I was taught in school, which was basically the layperson. So I'm applying the spiritual theology of St. John of the Cross. The layperson, according to what I was taught, ought to be in the purgative way, and the priest ought to be in the illuminative way, and the bishop in the unitive way. And then I learned about how baptism was seen as illumination for the early church, and how it's every Christian is, priest, prophet, and king. And especially with the divide between morality and the gifts of the Spirit, that being brought back together, I kind of came to this realization, wait a minute, we're all called to be in the unitive way. And it's not just the priest and the bishop. And then I started reading the Second Vatican Council, and then I started reading your blog, and I'm like, oh my goodness, this is exactly what needed to happen, a renewal in this understanding. There's no separation because of our vocations between our call to holiness. So could you talk about that?
Oh, geez, I could talk forever on that. That's my hobby horse. You're in my wheelhouse now. And that's why I do like Sirve Pinker's, the guy, the theologian that you mentioned, because one of the things the Second Vatican Council did call for was a renewal of moral theology to get out of this rule-based morality of obligations and, all this. And we do have obligations. We do have duties. But to begin and end with that as the one, Pinkers points out, for example, in his chapter in the Sermon on the Mount, let's look, how does Jesus start in Matthew chapter 5? How does he start the Sermon on the Mount? He starts it with the Beatitudes. All right. Blessed are the, poor in spirit, for they shall, inherit, and all this, blessed are the meek, blessed are the peacemakers. Well, what is that word blessed? Comes from beatus, Latin, which means happy, charmed, lucky, and we lose it all with this sort of anodyne term, blessed. It's blessed to be this, well, yeah, we hear this all the time, but blessed in that context, man, meant you are really one fortunate and happy person if your moral life revolves around the following realities. So what Pincus points out, the gospel gives us a morality of happiness, not so much a morality of obligations. It's not to deny that we don't have obligations. We do. Mm-hmm. But what is the motivation behind the obligations? Well, doing these things is going to make you happy. It's going to make you a more fulfilled person. And that is a call that we are all called to. We had professionalized the Beatitudes. We had professionalized the Sermon on the Mount. We had professionalized the evangelical counsels of poverty, chastity, and obedience. That's something that only celibate nuns and priests can do, and not even all priests. Diocesan priests don't take all those vows because, they're in the parishes, and so they can't be holy. Only guys in monasteries and religious orders can be holy because they can be really devoted to prayer and stuff. So you really you develop this very dualistic, unhealthy sort of atmosphere in the church where you had these, as Bishop Robert Barron says, these great spiritual athletes, those in the religious order, and then the rest of us slobs. And and that's what Dorothy Day and Peter Morin, who started the Catholic Worker Movement, that's what they were on about. This is what Peter Morin meant when he said we need to blow up the dynamite of the church. And the dynamite of the church is the universal call to holiness. We are all called to holiness. And Lumen Gentium Vatican II makes it very clear. Lumen Gentium chapter 5 makes it very clear. The married state is not a lesser sacrifice. The married state is a lesser eschatological sign than the celibate state, because in the next life there's not going to be marriage anymore. Okay, so that's why the church considers celibacy to be a higher state of life, because it is a higher sign value, whatever. But marriage, that has crept into our thinking to make it seem like, well, marriage is just something you got to do if you can't hack the religious life. Marriage is a remedy for concupiscence, Yep. Marriage is just keep you from getting too, horny or whatever. Marriage is to, for having babies and whatnot, but marriage isn't about holiness. Follow the commandments. That's good enough. That's not what Vatican II says, and that's not what Christ says. Notice in the Sermon on the Mount, he doesn't say, hey, by the way, guys, this is just for the spiritual elites. This is just for my disciples who are listening, or this is just until I come again, and you don't have to worry about any of this stuff, and I'm coming again soon. No. He meant it for everyone. We're to live the Sermon on the Mount. And this is something this is the most revolutionary thing that Vatican II sort of doubled down on. It's not a new thing. It's been, you mentioned Francis de Sales. He was like the champion of this way back when. He understood way back when, folks, we need the lay people. we kind of need the laity here.
Yeah, his introduction to a devout life, that was also a classic in spirituality. Yeah.
I taught for 20 years at De Sales University, which is run by the Oblates of St. Francis de Sales. So you are barking up my tree. I love Francis de Sales.
Yes, I've read a little bit, not much. I really enjoyed it. His treatise on the love of God, the theology. Yes. It's so beautiful, incredible. But yeah, so I got knocked off my Damascus horse as well, reading St. John Paul's Theology of the Body and how that ties into like his audiences, not some kind of shorter book that presents it, which is awesome and necessary, but actually reading John Paul's audiences. Like, it was not what I expected whatsoever, and how that ties into the universal call to holiness and to marriage as a sacrament. And also, kind of moving theology forward away from a slightly Manichaean Jansenistic understanding of the body and sex. So, yeah.
And unfortunately, due to certain popularizations of the theology of the body for chastity talks in Catholic high schools, and stuff like that, the impression has been, and by the way, those are good things. Yeah, dueling. I'm not. But my own one and only point, though, is that they had the bad effect of making it seem as if that's what the theology of the body was all about. It was about
Yeah.
sex, and it really wasn't. It was about the sacramentality of our bodies, and therefore, what is really glorious about the sacramentality of marriage, that it is what it's that is our modality in the world. We are present to the world as Christians in and through our marital bodies and the sacramentality of our marital bodies. And that does include sex and sexuality, yes, but it's broader than that. And you are right. And what he's really after at the end of the day is therein lies holiness.
Yeah, no, when I knew I was going to take that class, I was actually a little reticent. I was like, I'm about to study about sex. And, that's all it's going to be. How, as Christopher West puts it, genitals are made to generate. It's like, I don't want to do that. So, but I read John Paul's Theology, and the scope, as you said, was so much more. I started to understand the Eucharist in a different way, understand the role of Mary in a different way, understand the role of the church, understand the role of the community of the saints, understanding the role of virginity.
Yeah.
Everything was there, and it just floored me. And to this day, it's one of those books that I think will...
it's wonderful. And I think even Christopher West has come to see it. I mean, I know Chris West. He's a really great guy. And I but he is kind of who I had in mind when I was kind of scooping that before. And he has done great work. He's a great guy. He really is. But even he, I think, he's really, what's great about Christopher is that he takes criticism to heart.
Yeah.
And there were a lot of people that were criticizing him, saying, this is not the theology of the body and it's full order. And he said, yeah, you're right. And I think he's kind of retooled himself lately to be a little more inclusive of all of those sorts of things.
No, you're right. I also really enjoy, I read some of his stuff. I watch his videos, I'm not trying to bash him, but there is that trajectory, which is really awesome to see. Yeah. So,
no, he's a good guy.
Yeah. Well, if that's okay with you, I'm going to turn to patron and listener questions. There's just a couple here. Oh, more than a couple, but if you have to go, just let me know and we can cut it short.
No, I'm good.
Awesome.
I might have to pour another bourbon or something, but
well, I mean, this is definitely a lot of fun. But so Megan starts off with a question that's kind of an atomic bomb here. So she goes, "Do you agree with Dare We Hope?"
Yes, I do.
Okay,
but with the caveat that that Dare We Hope is not presented by Balthasar as here's what we all now should believe. And this is what the church should embrace. Balthasar was a loyal son of the church, and he always submitted himself to orthodox magisterial teaching of the church. Dare We Hope is a book very downstream from the majority of his theology, written relatively late in his career, where he engages in some theological speculation. And theologians are allowed to do that. He speculates. He says, and remember, the original German title is Was dürfen wir hoffen, which means what are we allowed to hope for? It's not dare we hope, which is a bad translation. It's what are we allowed to hope for? In other words, he's asking humbly, in the light of tradition, the New Testament, church teaching, are we allowed to hope for the salvation of all? And he reaches the conclusion, yes, we are allowed to hope for that. But he talks a lot about judgment and damnation in that book as well. So I don't want to be painted into the corner of a black and white, yes or no. Yes, I think everybody, Balthasar's not a universalist. He doesn't believe that it's dogma. Heaven. He doesn't know that. He pleads ignorance.
Yeah, it's not epistemic certainty. It's more of like the exercise of the theological virtue, which we see in the mystics, which is that all might be saved.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. Thomas asks, have you noticed a kind of Stoic mindset, discipline for its own sake, or justice over mercy in the traditionalist circle? We've kind of covered this.
I see that. Yeah. I see that. But I don't attend a traditional Latin Mass, so I will defer. I mean, I have a lot of traditionalist friends, And they all say, that's not what we're like. But then you go on social media and that's what they're like.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know if traditionalism on social media is different from traditionalism in the trenches. That's something I don't know.
Yeah. I have noticed a lot more, faithful, like accepting of Vatican II, living tradition type of traditionalists. They're usually in the diocesan parishes. It's when you get into the more the fraternities and the societies, it's a little different there. But again, these are generalizations. But
the thing is, nobody's done, I think, an empirical study, a Pew Research study of the attitudes of traditionalists, and I we have to be a little cautious about social media can really skew the opinions of people as to what's really going on in a movement, because social media is just all the loudmouths.
Yeah, absolutely. Who was it that said, you don't go viral for humility? That might have been Matt Fradd. I'm not sure.
Matt Fradd.
Yeah. So my friend Pablo asks, so this is a theological question. He says, the work of Dr. Feingold seems to have disproved the Lubach's exegesis on nature and grace. How do you circumvent this?
I circumvent it by denying the premise that Feingold has disproved de Lubach's thesis on nature and grace. I think Feingold is a very smart guy, but I think his own analysis is in a certain tradition rooted in the commentatorial tradition post-Aquinas more than in Aquinas himself. Furthermore, this question of Aquinas, to me, is a red herring. We have focused way too much on whether or not Aquinas thought our single natural final end is supernatural. In other words, that's the debate. What do we have? Do we have a final natural end and then a added supernatural end, which would be Feingold's position, or do we have de Lubach's position that we have a single natural final end, and that's God? And a de Lubach claim is that's what Aquinas teaches. Feingold says otherwise. But the fact of the matter is, I don't care what Aquinas teaches in a certain sense. Aquinas was wrong about some things, and no matter what he thought about the relationship between nature and grace and the ends of human existence, he could have been wrong. The deeper question is, what does Revelation teach? What does the New Testament and the Church Fathers? This is de Lubach's point. De Lubach says, if you read Aquinas properly through the lens of the Scriptures and the Church Fathers, and then you begin and you focus it on certain comments that Aquinas makes, then you begin to see Aquinas is not what his later commentators said he was. And Aquinas did not believe in this birthday cake, layered cake notion that the supernature is just added unto us like another layer of a cake unto our nature, which is complete in itself. That's complete anti-gospel nonsense. The idea that I'm not made for God. What about St. Paul? In him we move and live and have, created and have our being. John's prologue, that everything in the whole dadgum universe is created for Christ and in Christ and by Christ. This notion that, the world's kind of complete in itself and you can have Paradise Park even without God is risible nonsense. Because look at something here, and I want the traditionalists to take this to heart. And I'm not angry with the questioner, by the way. I'm just getting animated because I get this question all the time. It's a great question, and obviously your questioner knows some stuff. So that you're reading Feingold. You're reading Feingold. You're onto something good, and I don't hate Feingold. I know him, and he's just a good guy. But anyway, answer yourself this question: if I can have a purely natural happiness without God, why, if I reject God, do I go to hell for all eternity? The only reason that an eternal hell makes sense is if that in rejecting God, I'm rejecting my deepest self. If I have a purely natural final end, why? All the rejection of God, therefore, would mean is, thank you, I returned the bus ticket to heaven. Thank you very much. I get that you want me to go to Disney World, but I'm happy right here with the amusement park in my backyard. So thank you. I don't want to go. And yet now God's going to say, no, you have to go. And if you don't go, you're going to burn in hell for all eternity. That bespeaks to me that what is really going on here is that the rejection of God is the rejection of our deepest self. So a traditionalist has to explain to me, you can't have it both. You can't say rejecting God means rejecting myself and therefore I go to hell, and then turn around and say I have a purely natural final end and I can live perfectly happy life even without God. Thank you very much. Doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah. To be fair to Pablo, he's not a traditionalist, but you're right, though. These are the kinds of questions I have heard from traditionalists.
It's a great question. It's like actually the best question of all. That's the question. And you've really nailed it. That's the question. That's the fundament of it right there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And what was I going to say? Oh, yeah, about nature and grace. For the audience, if you're interested in this topic, I do have an episode with Dr. Declue where he defends de Lubach's position. It's one of my most popular episodes. It's heavy theology, so if you're ready to stomach it,
I would like to see that. I would like to. I'm going to have to look that up.
I'll send it to you if you want.
Please do. I would like to see that.
Okay, sounds good. Well, the last question is from me, and it is: why is your blog called Gaudium et Spes 22?
Yeah, I went back and forth about that because it's not something that rolls off the tongue. All right, Gaudium et Spes, means the joys and the hopes. Gaudium, joy; spes, hope, and it's the very last document promulgated by the Second Vatican Council. It's the pastoral constitution on the church in the modern world. It's not a dogmatic council; it's pastoral. And it was one of the most contended and contentious documents of the whole council. It was the very last one promulgated in 1965, I think December. Yet, it is an important document, even though it's just pastoral and not dogmatic. The 22nd section of Gaudium et Spes 22 begins with a statement: it is only in the mystery of the incarnate Word that the mystery of man comes to light. John Paul II quoted that in every one of his encyclicals. He made it the centerpiece of his retrieval, his theological retrieval of the council. Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict, pointed out that comment in Gaudium et Spes 22, as well as Gaudium et Spes 10 and Gaudium et Spes 45, which repeats that essentially, is what Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict, called the Christocentric, Christological bombshell at the heart of the council, because it is the interpretive key to the entire council. If you want to understand the Second Vatican Council, what it is an attempt to reorient every doctrine of the faith around Christ. Forget all of the barnacles that have encrusted on the church over the centuries. Let's focus on Christ again. And that's why I blog, which is really in many ways a defense of Vatican II, Gaudium et Spes 22, because I think it's the key to the whole council. That's not to say you can't criticize the council. Like all councils, it made mistakes. It had blind spots. There are a lot of blind spots in the council. A lot of things we could say to criticize it. But overall, I think it's a beautiful, beautiful council that we need to embrace more fully, rather than to reject. And I think a lot of traditionalists, they picked up a lot of talking points, from the Taylor Marshalls of the church, the Peter Kwasniewskis of the church. They picked up a lot of talking points without actually having read the documents themselves. And that's a shame.
Yeah, and that's a whole different conversation about, can you criticize councils, and if you're going to apply your criticism to others as well. Because, you can put Trent on a pedestal and trash Vatican II, but be fair in your criticism. So for example, Nicaea was convened for politically dubious reasons, Constantine, reasons of power and ambiguities. You have ambiguities in almost all councils. I mean, you have ambiguities in scripture, for Pete's sake.
Yeah. I'm so glad you brought this up, because one of the chief complaints traditionalists have about Vatican II is look at the chaos that it caused. Well, just ask Saint Athanasius what he thought about the chaos after the Council of Nicaea, because he had to basically hide from the emperor at every turn. Yeah.
That was most of the questions. It is about the interview's a little over an hour, so I think this is a great place to stop. Before I let you go, where can we find more about your work?
I would just say go to my blog, Gaudium et Spes, all one word, by the way, Gaudium et Spes 22.com, and That's where you'll find a lot of my stuff. And that's where that's where I would go. I mean, you could read my books, but I wouldn't recommend it.
Well, speaking of books, are you working on any projects anytime?
Oh, yeah, I'm working on a book for Word on Fire, Bishop Barron's ministry on the universal cult to holiness. And I'm working on a book for Ignatius Press on essentially the crisis in the church, the modern world, all the usual gobbledygook that people write about.
Awesome. Well, Dr. Chapp, thank you so much for being on. It was a really fun conversation. I hope that the audience will enjoy it and learn from it and answer some of their questions. There's many more, of course, but it's a good start. So without further ado, we'll see you guys next week.